Great, thank you very much. Very good to see everyone again. So yeah, I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to this weekend and what we're doing, building on what Kayla has already said. So let me just share my screen there. So you're already familiar, I think, with the plan for the weekends as a whole. So we had those first 2 weekends when we were exploring the ideas overall by way of starting points. Now we're going through the various parts of the democratic system weekend by weekend. So at weekend 3, we looked at the roles of government and parliament. Last time we were looking at the roles of the public. And this time we are focusing, as Kayla said, on upholding rules and standards. So just what does that mean? Well, if you think back to weekend 2, when we were looking at what limits should be placed on government, there were various kind of basic principles that you were exploring and that you were coming up with in your discussions about things that we might want to protect in the system. So we might want to ensure that people in politics, people in positions of power, are following high standards of ethical behavior. That's something that's been very much in the news over the last few weeks as well. A lot of you were concerned as well about upholding basic rights. And there was also a point about protecting basic features of democracy. So we can't have Parliament just deciding to suddenly abolish elections, for example. So the question that we're focusing on in this weekend is really, if these are some of the things that we care about, how do we ensure that these things happen? How do we uphold standards? How do we protect basic features, basic principles? And in essence, there are 2 kinds of answers to that question. So one of those answers says we should do it through politics, and the other one says we need to do it, at least in part, through rules. So I'm just about to say what I mean by both of those things. Just before I do so, I should emphasize that I don't think anyone would say that it's a kind of either or choice between politics or rules, that we can have everything through one or the other. Everyone would say it's a matter of balance between these 2 things. So that's just worth bearing in mind. So what do I mean by upholding basic principles through politics? Well, basically, I mean doing it through those processes that we've been focusing on over the last 2 weekends, that process of the representative system, where we, the voters, elect our representatives in Parliament, and Parliament then forms the government. And then going in the other direction, government ministers are accountable to Parliament, and MPs in Parliament are accountable to us as voters. So one view says that it's that process of representation and accountability that best ensures that we can protect the basic principles that we care about. But then the other view would say that, well, that's maybe fine for many things, but it's not enough on its own. We need something in addition to that. And we also need a system of rules. And a system of rules basically has 2 parts. So it has the rules themselves, and there also needs to be some way of enforcing those rules, making sure the rules are actually followed. So when we're talking about rules, probably most obviously we're thinking about laws. So we're all subject to laws. People in power are also subject to laws, and the laws are enforced through the courts, of course. So the courts hear cases and decide whether the law has been broken or not. If they see that the law has been broken, then they're able to issue penalties. But there are many, many other kinds of rules. So Kayla's just set out our conversation guidelines for the Citizens' Assembly. In a way, those are kind of rules, but there's a softer form of rules than the hard law that I've mentioned already. And it's kind of the same in the world of politics as well. So in particularly when we're thinking about standards of ethical behavior, we also want to be aware of things that are called codes of conduct, which some of you will be aware of, that are often upheld, enforced, or at least monitored by regulators. Now that might be a little bit mysterious to some of you, to many of you, I suspect, just at the moment, but worry not, we will explore these things further over the course of the morning. And codes of conduct can come in many different forms. Sometimes they're quite close to being laws in terms of how kind of rigorous and strict they are. Other times they're a bit closer to our own conversation guidelines in being guidelines for how we ought to behave. So basically our question for this weekend is, for upholding basic principles, where should the balance lie between politics and rules for upholding those principles? But that's a really big question. So we want to break it down a bit. And we've got 2 main questions, as Kayla said at the start. that we're focusing in on. So those are the examples of principles that I offered at the start. So one of those was ensuring high standards of ethical behavior. And that actually relates directly to one of the questions that we're focusing on over the weekend. How should standards of ethical behavior, particularly among politicians, people in positions of power, be upheld? And then those other two principles that I mentioned, well, those are basically kind of examples of our second question, which is to what extent should government and parliament be subject to legal limits? So let me just say a few words about each of those questions, starting off with the first one there, how should standards of ethical behavior be upheld? So we might be concerned, for example, about how can we best tackle corruption? We might be interested in asking how can we ensure that politicians are honest? We might be thinking about what if a minister is accused of bullying officials? What should be done? And with something like corruption, you might think, well, clearly the law should be coming in there, just as if we're found to be corrupt, we would be subject to the law. So the same for people in positions of power. And therefore the law and the courts would be involved. If we're looking at something like honesty and dishonesty, though, do we really want the courts to be making rulings on what things politicians can and cannot say, or might that actually be quite dangerous in a democracy for free speech? So these are the sorts of questions that we're going to be exploring around to what extent we can operate through politics or through rules for upholding the many different kinds of standards of ethical behavior that we might care about. And then there's the question, to what extent should government and parliament be subject to legal limits? So there are kind of two bits to that question, I suppose. There's one about government and there's one about parliament. So maybe worth just breaking those down and considering each in turn. I'll start off with parliament, actually. So one of the basic principles of the constitution that we've gone back to several times, goes right back to our first weekend when Parm introduced this concept of parliamentary sovereignty. So that's two very big long words, but basically parliamentary sovereignty means, in theory, the UK Parliament can pass any law it likes. Parliament can pass any law it might choose to introduce. So Parliament could, in theory, decide to abolish elections, or Parliament could, in theory, decide that it's going to ban eating any food on Tuesdays. You know, Parliament could do anything in theory. So what is it that stops Parliament from passing really crazy laws, from breaking those basic principles that we might think are important? Well, one view says that it's the political process that is the best protection against bad laws. So it's that process by which we are electing our representatives, we're choosing the members of parliament, and we're holding those members of parliament to account. So we are actually really important in upholding these basic principles, and our behavior really matters as well. But the other view says, well, no, actually, that's fine so far as it goes, but we need a little bit more, and argues that we need legal limits on the laws that Parliament can pass. So that's Parliament. And then on the government side, so government doesn't have sovereignty. Government ministers can only act within their powers. They can only do what they are allowed to do. So here's the question. The question is, how do we ensure that they do stick within those powers? And again, one view would say it's through the political process that we should do that. And the other view would say, well, actually, we need the judges who are enforcing the rules on what government ministers can do. So overall, we have the questions for the weekend. That first question, how should standards of ethical behavior be upheld, is, are these political processes of representation and accountability enough, or do we need something more? And then secondly, to what extent should government and parliament be subject to legal limits? And within that, we've got parliament. So should there be limits on the laws that parliament can pass? And government, how do we ensure that government ministers act within their powers? And that's what we're doing this weekend. Back to Kayla.